is Genene Jones. Genene Ann Jones is a former pediatric nurse and convicted serial killer who worked in Texas hospitals during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Accounts from the people who knew her described a pattern of fabricated illnesses, attention-seeking behavior, and a tendency to place herself at the center of a crisis. As a nurse, a disturbing pattern emerged. Infants and young children under her care began suffering unexplained medical emergencies. Investigators eventually discovered evidence that some children had been deliberately injected with dangerous substances. Jones was convicted in 1984 of murdering 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan. In 2020, Jones pled guilty to the murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer. Authorities have long suspected she may have been responsible for dozens of additional deaths, with some estimates ranging as high as 60 victims. What makes this case particularly chilling is that the crimes occurred in hospitals, a place where parents entrusted health care professionals with the lives of their children. Now that we know who Genene Jones was, what does her birth chart reveal? And can forensic astrology uncover even deeper symbolic patterns? Genene Jones has the Sun, Mercury, Uranus, and possibly the Moon, all in the sign of Cancer. When a confirmed birth time isn't available, I work with the solar chart method, casting the chart for noon at the place of birth, placing the Sun on the ascendant. This allows me to analyze planetary placements by sign and house, while acknowledging that the Moon's exact position may vary by up to 6 degrees on either side of its noon placement. Therefore, Genene Jones' moon could be in the late degrees of Gemini or the early degrees of Cancer, and either placement amplifies her Sun conjunct Mercury in her chart. Cancer is the archetype of the caregiver, associated with nurturing, protection, children, and motherhood. Given that Jones worked in pediatric care, the Cancer symbolism is striking. Mercury's conjunction to the Sun fuses the identity with the mind, creating someone whose thinking and self-image become deeply intertwined. This conjunction describes a person whose perceptions and beliefs become central to their identity. In Cancer, those perceptions are filtered through emotions, personal experiences, and one's own needs. One of the most important configurations in this chart is the square between the Sun-Mercury conjunction and the Mars-Neptune conjunction. When Mars and Neptune join together, actions often occur indirectly or behind the scenes. This energy can manifest as deception, manipulation, hidden actions, or behavior that remains concealed from public view. For a nurse accused of causing medical crisis involving injections and pharmaceuticals, while appearing to be a caregiver, the Mars-Neptune conjunction in the third house provides a powerful symbolic image of actions that remained hidden behind a carefully managed story. The significance of this conjunction is amplified because it forms a square to the Sun-Mercury conjunction. This creates tension between identity, thought processes, and the hidden motivations represented by Mars conjunct Neptune. The aspect suggests a lifelong struggle between the image a person presents to the world and the deeper forces operating beneath the surface. Genene Jones has retrograde Jupiter in Pisces in the 8th house. This amplifies the dynamics. The 8th house is associated with transformation, crisis, obsession, and shared resources, death, and hidden forces that shape human behavior. Its retrograde condition suggests that its influence is directed inward, reinforcing personal beliefs, private convictions, and subjective interpretations of experience. With Neptune as the 8th house dispositor of Jupiter, it brings in themes of pharmaceuticals, confusion, and concealment. The Sun-Mercury conjunction is sesquadrant, the 8th house, Jupiter in Pisces. This is a rare aspect that can create a tendency to rationalization, self-justification, or an inflated belief that one's actions serve a greater purpose, and it is often seen in the charts of serial killers. Jones's Saturn is in the second house in the sign of Virgo. Saturn in Virgo is associated with themes of hospitals, nursing, and the care of the vulnerable. The individual may derive self-worth from being needed, relied upon, or recognized for their ability to manage difficult situations. Being placed in the second house indicates concerns surrounding self-worth, insecurity, fear, and a need for constant validation. Saturn in Virgo in the second is expressed through precision, perfection, and a desire to be viewed as indispensable. In Genene Jones' case, again, the symbolism is particularly striking, as those who knew her described patterns of attention-seeking behavior, fabricated illnesses, and a tendency to place herself at the center of a crisis. The Sun-Mercury conjunction is sextile the second house Saturn in Virgo. This placement often creates an individual who gains a sense of self-worth through being useful, competent, and needed by others. For Jones, the hospital may have become more than a workplace. It became the stage upon which deeper insecurities surrounding self-worth, recognition, and importance were played out. Jones also has Pluto in Leo in the first house, and it is ruled by the Sun, adding another layer of complexity. Pluto is associated with power, control, obsession, transformation, and compulsion. In the first house, these themes become woven into the personality itself. People with Pluto in the first house often possess an intense presence. They may feel compelled to influence situations, control outcomes, or place themselves in positions of significance. There is frequently a fascination with power dynamics operating beneath the surface. Because Pluto is in Leo and is ruled by the Sun, it connects themes of power and control directly back to the Sun-Mercury conjunction, creating a desire to exert control over one's environment. Genene Jones's moon is in the 12th house, conjunct Uranus. Regardless of whether we have the birth time available or not, the moon will still be conjunct Uranus and in the 12th house. The 12th house is associated with hidden motivations, secrets, self-undoing, institutions, hospitals, confinement, and activities that occur behind the scenes. It is often described as the house of the unconscious mind, where psychological patterns operate outside of our awareness. The moon represents emotions, instinctive responses, and the need for emotional security. As the ruler of the chart, it becomes one of the most important indicators of Jones's emotional nature. Uranus introduces themes of disruption, unpredictability, shock, and sudden events. When joined with the moon, emotional responses often become unconventional, intense, or difficult for others to understand. Moon conjunct Uranus individuals frequently react differently than those around them. There can be a need for excitement, stimulation, or circumstances that break the routine of everyday life. Ordinary situations may feel emotionally unsatisfying, while periods of crisis or heightened intensity can create a sense of purpose, engagement, and emotional satisfaction. In Jones's case, this symbolism is particularly noteworthy, as investigators suggested that she may have created medical emergencies in order to position herself as the person who responded to them. The symbolism of the Moon-Uranus conjunction in the 12th house is consistent with an attraction to crisis, disruption, and situations that generate strong emotional reactions. The Moon-Uranus conjunction also forms a trine to retrograde Jupiter in Pisces in the 8th house. This aspect creates an easy flow between the unconscious mind and the deeper psychological themes of the 8th house. Jupiter magnifies emotional experiences, personal beliefs, and psychological patterns. The trine allows material to flow easily into conscious awareness, often creating vivid fantasies and a fascination with hidden, mysterious, or taboo subjects. There may be a natural attraction to psychological exploration, crisis situations, or experiences that evoke powerful emotional responses. At its highest expression, this configuration can produce remarkable intuition, compassion, and psychological insight. In its shadow experience, it can blur the line between emotional reality and personal perception, making it easier to rationalize behavior through deeply held beliefs or internal narratives. Taken together, the Moon-Uranus conjunction in the 12th house and its trine to Jupiter in the 8th describe a personality with an exceptionally active inner world, one drawn toward intensity, crisis, and the hidden dimensions of human experience. As we move into examining Genene Jones' chart through the lens of forensic astrology, the themes in her birth chart become surprisingly relevant, repeatedly linking caregiving, health, victims' crisis, and death through a network of interconnected planets and houses. But before we begin, let me briefly explain one of the techniques I use in forensic astrology, the derived house system. In forensic astrology, I use what is called derived houses. The 7th house represents the victim and is treated as the victim's first house. From there, I count houses from the victim's perspective rather than the perspective of the person whose chart I am examining. For example, if you want to find the victim's 4th house, which is associated with their end of life and final outcome, I count 4 houses, starting with the 7th house as the first. This brings us to the 10th house in the chart. Using the same technique, the 12th house becomes the victim's 6th house of health and illnesses, while the 2nd house becomes the victim's 8th house of death and transformation. This allows us to examine the chart from the victim's perspective and look for symbolic connections between the victim, their health, their final outcome, and the individual whose chart we are analyzing. Once we apply this technique to Genene Jones's chart, some remarkable patterns begin to emerge. In this chart, Capricorn occupies the 7th house cusp, making Saturn the ruler of the victim. Saturn is placed in Virgo in the 2nd house. This is significant because the 2nd house of Genene's birth chart is the 8th house, representing death and transformation of the victims. The ruler of the victims is therefore placed in the victim's derived house of death, in the sign most closely connected to medical environments, Virgo. The house of the victim's health provides another important layer to the forensic analysis. As discussed earlier, we examined the chart from the victim's perspective. Genene Jones's 12th house becomes the victim's 6th house of health, illness, and medical treatment. This is particularly significant because the 12th house is traditionally associated with hospitals, institutions, secrets, hidden activities, and matters that remain unseen or operate behind the scenes. In other words, the victim's house of health falls in a house associated with hospitals and circumstances concealed from public view. The symbolism becomes even more striking when we examine the planets occupying this house. The moon, the ruler of Genene Jones's chart, is conjunct Uranus in the 12th house. The moon represents the native herself, while Uranus is associated with disruption, instability, shock, and sudden events. The chart ruler is therefore placed in the victim's house of health alongside a planet associated with unexpected and disruptive circumstances. This configuration forms a trine to retrograde Jupiter in Pisces in the 8th house of Genene's chart. Jupiter expands whatever it touches, and in the 8th house, it magnifies themes of crisis, transformation, mortality, and profound, life-changing events. From a forensic astrology perspective, this creates a symbolic connection between the chart ruler, the victim's health, hospitals, and institutions in the 8th house, and the 8th house themes of crisis and transformation. Viewed alongside the other forensic indicators in the chart, the symbolism once again links the victims, their health, and the medical environment through a network of interconnected houses and planets. The next forensic layer involves examining the victim's end of life. In forensic astrology, the 4th house from the 7th house of the victim represents the victim's final circumstances, end of life, and ultimate outcome. When we derive this house from Jones's 7th house, We arrive at Jones's 10th house as the fourth house of the victim. This is particularly significant because the 10th house is the house of public reputation, career, status, recognition, and how a person becomes known in the world. In Jones's chart, Aries occupies the 10th house cusp, which is the fourth house of an end of life of the victim, making Mars the ruler of both her public standing and the victim's end of life circumstances. Aries is associated with action, initiative, urgency, and the desire to take charge. It seeks to be first, to act decisively and leave its mark. In a public house such as the 10th, Aries often creates an individual who wants to be noticed, recognized, and remembered for their actions. The symbolism becomes remarkable because the same planet that rules Jones's public reputation also rules the victim's derived house of final outcomes. Mars, the ruler of Aries, is located in Libra in the third house and is conjunct Neptune. As we've already seen, the Mars-Neptune conjunction is one of the most dominant configurations in the chart of Genene Jones. Mars represents action, while Neptune is associated with concealment, confusion, medications, and circumstances that are difficult to clearly see. What does this analysis tell us? From a forensic astrology perspective, the chart reveals a direct symbolic link between Jones's public reputation and the planetary ruler associated with the victim's final circumstances. In hindsight, her public identity and reputation became inseparable from the deaths of the children under her care. With the ruler of her 10th house of public standing and notoriety also ruling the victim's end-of-life house, it creates an overlap of striking symbolic connections between her public legacy and the events for which she became infamous. Whether viewed psychologically or through the lens of forensic astrology, the same things continue to emerge throughout the chart: caregiving, hospitals, vulnerable individuals, crisis, and transformation. What makes the chart of Genene Jones remarkable is that these themes are not isolated. They are woven together through multiple houses, rulerships, and planetary relationships. With the benefit of hindsight, the symbolism appears to reflect many of the circumstances that ultimately made Genene Jones one of the most infamous nurses in American criminal history.